Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into one of the most haunting chapters of Latin American history. In 1973, Chile witnessed a dramatic event that shook its foundations, the end of democracy through a sudden and violent coup. Tanks rolled into Santiago, jets screamed across the skies, and within a single day, the nation changed forever. This is the story of how dreams of democracy collided with the weight of power. If you appreciate calm, reflective journeys through forgotten times, don't forget to tap like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching, and tell me, what hidden story should we uncover together next? In the early 1970s, Chile stood at a crossroads. It was one of the few nations in South America with a long tradition of peaceful political change, having managed multiple transitions of leadership without bloodshed. The election of Salvador Allende in 1970 marked a historic moment. He became the world's first freely elected Marxist president. His victory came through democratic means, with promises of deep reforms, redistributing wealth, nationalizing key industries, and expanding rights for workers and the poor. For some Chileans, this was the dawn of a brighter future, a time when long-ignored voices might finally be heard. For others, however, it was a source of fear, especially among business elites and conservative sectors who worried that their privileges and assets would vanish. Allende's government quickly set ambitious goals. Copper, the lifeblood of Chile's economy, was nationalized, and land reforms began redistributing estates to peasants. Prices on basic goods were frozen to curb inflation, and wages were raised to boost living standards. For a time, many celebrated these changes. Workers marched with banners supporting the government, children received free milk in schools, and cultural programs flourished. But underneath these achievements, tensions grew. Inflation remained a stubborn challenge, shortages began to appear, and foreign pressure, particularly from the United States, quietly intensified. Washington feared Chile might become another Cuba, spreading socialist influence across the continent. The Nixon administration and the CIA began covert efforts to destabilize Allende's presidency, funding opposition media, strikes, and political movements to weaken his base. Meanwhile, Chile's middle class felt squeezed, worried about empty store shelves and the uncertainty of constant change. The political atmosphere grew more polarized by the day. Parliament clashed with the executive branch, right-wing groups staged protests, and left-wing activists pushed Allende to move even faster with reforms. The streets of Santiago filled with graffiti, slogans, and rallies that symbolized a country tearing itself apart ideologically. The Chilean military, traditionally loyal to the constitution, watched from the sidelines, but discontent brewed quietly within their ranks. Some officers resented Allende's growing ties to radical groups, while others feared that Chile's institutions would collapse under economic strain. Rumors of plots, counterplots, and outside influence swirled constantly, creating an atmosphere where trust was rare and uncertainty was constant. As 1973 approached, the country stood like a fragile glass, brilliant and hopeful, yet ready to shatter with a single blow. The stage was set for the dramatic events of September 11th, a day that would be remembered not only in Chile but across the world as the moment democracy itself was crushed in broad daylight. After Allende's election, his government tried to move quickly with what he called the Chilean road to socialism. It was a unique path, because unlike revolutions in other countries, this was not achieved through armed struggle but through ballots. Allende believed it was possible to transform Chile peacefully, respecting democratic institutions while redistributing wealth and changing social structures. For the poor and working-class Chileans, this vision brought a sense of pride and hope. They felt history was finally turning in their favour. Yet, almost immediately, powerful forces began working against him. The United States saw Allende's rise as a threat to its influence in Latin America. Declassified documents later revealed conversations inside the Nixon administration, where leaders vowed to make the Chilean economy scream. Economic aid was cut, loans were blocked, and covert funding poured into opposition groups. At the same time, Chile's domestic elites, Especially large landowners and business leaders resisted reforms that threatened their wealth. They feared that redistribution would permanently dismantle their privileges. This resistance took many forms, from press campaigns warning about chaos to strikes that disrupted transport and essential services. Within just a year, everyday Chileans started to feel the consequences. Inflation climbed rapidly, savings lost value, and basic products like cooking oil, flour and meat became scarce. In grocery lines, people waited for hours, only to find shelves half empty. These shortages created frustration that spread across neighbourhoods, leading many in the middle class, who had initially been open to Allende's experiment, to turn against him. The political climate grew sharper with each month. The Christian Democrats, once allies in Parliament, distanced themselves, while conservative parties hardened their opposition. The government pushed forward with reforms, but every step was met with louder resistance. Strikes by truck owners in 1972 nearly paralysed the country, leaving goods rotting on the highways while cities struggled to get supplies. The situation became not only an economic crisis, but also a battle for legitimacy. Was Allende truly carrying out the will of the people, or was he, as his critics claimed, dismantling democracy itself? Meanwhile, workers and grassroots groups grew more radical, demanding faster and deeper change. They organised neighbourhood committees, factories were occupied, and self-managed programs sprang up. This dual power, between official government structures and local committees, worried the opposition and fuelled fears of a looming civil conflict. The military, still officially neutral, watched with unease. General Carlos Prats, the commander-in-chief of the army, remained loyal to the constitution and resisted pressure to intervene. Yet not all his officers shared his patience. Behind closed doors, meetings and whispers about a coup began to circulate. The fragile balance of Chilean democracy was breaking, with trust between citizens eroding and polarization deepening. By mid-1973, the nation was on edge, like a tightrope walker above a deep chasm, every step heavier, every movement more dangerous. By the middle of 1973, Chile was living in a climate of constant tension. Protests filled the streets of Santiago almost every week. On one side, government supporters marched with banners of solidarity, singing songs of unity and shouting slogans that celebrated the socialist project. On the other, opposition rallies denounced shortages, blamed the administration for mismanagement, and demanded a return to stability. The city felt like two different nations occupying the same space, each convinced the other was leading Chile into disaster. At the heart of this crisis was the daily struggle for survival. Housewives stood in long lines outside bakeries, clutching ration cards and hoping for bread that often never arrived. Students debated politics in classrooms, sometimes more passionately than their professors. Workers discussed the future in factories, where production slowed due to lack of materials or strikes. Conversations in buses, cafes and markets revolved around politics, as if the entire country was holding its breath. It became impossible to remain neutral, as neighbours, colleagues and even families split along ideological lines. This polarisation was not only emotional, but also institutional. Parliament became a battlefield of accusations, with the opposition controlling enough seats to block many of Allende's initiatives. Conservative newspapers ran headlines predicting collapse, while government-backed radio stations painted a picture of resilience and hope. The media war amplified divisions, creating two competing realities. Each citizen chose which version of Chile they believed in. Meanwhile, the military leadership grew restless. General Carlos Prats, loyal to constitutional rule, struggled to contain growing discontent within the ranks. Younger officers, influenced by conservative ideology and frustrated by constant strikes, pushed for action. Prats faced harassment in public, with opposition demonstrators surrounding his car and shouting insults. His commitment to legality, once respected, now seemed like weakness to many of his peers. The balance of power was shifting silently but decisively. Across the Andes, neighbouring countries watched carefully. Chile's experiment was unique, and if successful, it might inspire others. But if it failed, it could be used as a warning against peaceful socialist transitions. International attention intensified, with journalists and diplomats reporting on every crisis. The Cold War context magnified everything. To Washington, Chile was a chess piece that could not be allowed to drift left unchecked. To Moscow and Havana, it was proof that socialist change through democracy was possible. This external pressure added layers of complexity to an already fragile situation. By July, one dramatic incident shook the country. The so-called tanquetazo, an attempted coup led by a tank regiment in Santiago. Though quickly suppressed, the sight of armoured vehicles on city streets marked a turning point. Many Chileans realised that a coup was no longer a distant fear but an imminent danger. For Allende's supporters, the failed uprising was both a relief and a warning. For his enemies, it showed the image of tanks firing on government buildings, even if only for a few hours, shattered illusions that the military would remain entirely loyal to the Constitution. Though the attempt was crushed, it exposed the cracks inside the armed forces and the willingness of some units to act independently. For President Allende, it was both a wake-up call and a test of resilience. He addressed the nation, assuring citizens that Chilean democracy was strong, but his words struggled to compete with the sound of gunfire still echoing in people's memories. Daily life after the incident grew more unstable. Strikes multiplied, from copper miners to shopkeepers, creating shortages that touched nearly every home. Gasoline lines stretched for blocks, and rumours of sabotage filled the air. Opposition parties accused Allende of incompetence, while his supporters accused the opposition of deliberately destabilising the country. The truth was a mix of both, but perception mattered more than facts, and perception was tilting against the government. By August, General Carlos Prats resigned as Commander-in-Chief, exhausted by the pressure and public humiliation he faced. His replacement was General Augusto Pinochet, a quiet, disciplined officer who at first gave little indication of political ambition. Allende trusted him, describing him as loyal, but history would prove otherwise. With Pinochet in charge, the armed forces gained a leader who carefully studied the situation, building alliances within the military while maintaining a facade of neutrality. In Parliament, tensions reached a boiling point. The opposition-dominated Chamber of Deputies issued a resolution accusing Allende of violating the Constitution and calling on the military to restore order. Though it did not explicitly demand a coup, the message was clear. Large sectors of the political establishment no longer recognized the government's legitimacy. For Allende, this was a devastating blow. He still believed in dialogue, meeting with union leaders, party officials, and even opponents to seek compromise. Yet the space for negotiation was disappearing. The far left wanted him to arm workers and resist any coup with force, while moderates urged restraint. Trapped between these demands, Allende chose to continue defending constitutional paths, even as the walls closed in. The mood in Santiago grew heavier with each passing day. People whispered about the possibility of a golpe, a military takeover, but no one knew when or how it would happen. Soldiers patrolled nervously, politicians argued bitterly, and ordinary citizens tried to stockpile food, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. On the surface, Chile still functioned as a democracy. Parliament met, newspapers printed, schools operated, but beneath the surface the system was crumbling. Everyone sensed that September would bring a decisive moment, though few could imagine the scale of what was about to unfold. The stage was fully set, and the players had taken their positions. Only the final act remained. In the first days of September 1973, Santiago felt strangely calm, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The political tension had reached such intensity that silence carried its own weight. People lined up at markets in the early morning, hoping to buy whatever food they could before shelves emptied. In cafes, whispers replaced open debates, and the once vibrant student demonstrations became quieter, almost expectant. It was not peace, but the pause before something irreversible. Inside La Moneda, the presidential palace, Salvador Allende worked tirelessly, meeting with advisors and union leaders late into the night. He believed that dialogue could still rescue Chilean democracy. Plans for a referendum were being discussed, a national vote to let the people decide whether he should continue in office. If successful, this might have calmed tensions and given his government legitimacy again, but time was running out, and his opponents had already chosen a different path. Within the armed forces, secret meetings multiplied. Generals, admirals, and Air Force commanders gathered quietly to finalize plans for a coup. General Pinochet, once viewed as cautious, now emerged as the key figure. His calm demeanor concealed decisive intent. He spoke little, but his authority reassured other officers who worried about the risks of seizing power. By early September, the plan was set. On the morning of September 11th, the military would move against the government. Soldiers would surround La Moneda. The Navy would secure the ports, and the Air Force would bomb strategic targets. The coup would be swift and overwhelming, leaving little chance for resistance. Meanwhile, the opposition in Parliament and business circles anticipated the event with silent approval. For them, it was not only about removing Allende, but about erasing the socialist project from Chilean soil. The CIA maintained contact with opposition groups, ensuring funds and resources kept flowing, though the United States would never openly admit direct involvement in planning. Among ordinary Chileans, fear was mixed with confusion. Some still clung to hope that compromise might prevail, while others prepared for violence. Parents kept children at home, sensing danger. Shopkeepers hid supplies in back rooms, unsure of what chaos might erupt. Radio programs filled the air with speculation, each rumour spreading faster than the last. Yet Allende remained determined. In one of his last cabinet meetings, he reminded his ministers that they must stand firm, not for him personally, but for the principle of democracy itself. "History is ours," he said quietly, "and the people make it." Outside the palace, however, forces of history were moving with a speed no one could stop. On the eve of September 11th, the city seemed unusually quiet, as if Santiago itself had surrendered to the weight of destiny. The sky darkened, and behind closed doors generals prepared their orders, while families across Chile went to bed uncertain of the morning that awaited them. Dawn broke over Santiago on September 11th, 1973, with a deceptive calm. The city stirred awake like any other day. Vendors prepared their stalls, buses rumbled through the streets, and workers set off for factories. Yet beneath the ordinary sounds of morning, something else was moving. Columns of soldiers left their barracks, tanks rolled quietly toward the city centre, and naval ships positioned themselves along the coast. The coup was no longer a rumour. It was unfolding in real time. At 6 a.m, President Allende received the first calls warning him of unusual military movements. He dressed quickly, put on his helmet, and left for La Moneda, the presidential palace, determined to face whatever came. His aides pleaded with him to flee, to seek refuge and perhaps organise resistance from abroad, but he refused. "I was chosen by the people," he reminded them, "and I will remain with them." By 7 o'clock, Santiago was no longer the same city. Roadblocks appeared, bridges were closed, and radio stations were seized by the military. Uniformed officers announced over loudspeakers that the armed forces were restoring order. For many citizens, the words brought a chilling clarity. The coup had begun. Inside La Moneda, the president gathered his closest allies. Ministers, doctors, and a small guard unit joined him in preparing for what was clearly a siege. Allende spoke calmly, giving instructions to secure the palace and urging everyone to remain disciplined. Outside, however, the military build-up intensified. By mid-morning, tanks encircled the building and soldiers took positions on rooftops. Loudspeakers demanded that Allende resign and surrender. He refused. At 9 o'clock, the Air Force launched its strike. Jet fighters screamed across the skies of Santiago before diving toward the heart of the city. Bombs fell on La Moneda with deafening force, shattering windows, collapsing walls, and sending smoke into the sky. Civilians nearby covered their ears and ran for cover. while others watched in shock from balconies. For many, it was the first time they'd ever seen their capital city under bombardment. Inside the palace, chaos reigned. Flames spread quickly as the structure shook from repeated impacts. Allende remained composed, moving from room to room, offering encouragement to his staff, and making final calls to loyalists across the country. Over the radio, he delivered what would become his last speech, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He spoke of loyalty, of the dignity of sacrifice, and of his unshaken faith in Chile's future. "They may silence me," he declared, "but you cannot silence history." Outside, the military pressed forward, convinced that victory was within reach. Citizens huddled in their homes, listening to fragments of radio transmissions and wondering how long the palace would hold. For Chile, the morning of September 11th marked the irreversible end of one era and the violent beginning of another. As the bombing of La Moneda continued, thick black smoke rose above Santiago, visible from nearly every corner of the city. Residents stood on rooftops or peered from windows, watching in disbelief as their presidential palace burned. The heart of Chilean democracy was under attack, and the sound of explosions blended with the cries of sirens and the hum of military vehicles. For ordinary citizens, there was no way to intervene, only to witness. Inside La Moneda, conditions grew desperate. Walls cracked, ceilings collapsed, and the air filled with choking dust. Yet President Allende remained steadfast, moving through the corridors with quiet determination. He wore a steel helmet and carried an AK-47 rifle, a gift from Fidel Castro, but his demeanor was calm rather than combative. Those around him later recalled his resolve, his insistence that the defense of the palace was symbolic, not military. He knew the end was near, but he wanted that end to carry dignity. Around midday, as the building burned, Allende delivered his final radio address to the nation. His words carried across the airwaves, broadcast by the few stations not yet silenced by the military. In that speech he spoke directly to the Chilean people, telling them that he would not resign, that he would not betray their trust, and that his life would end with loyalty to his mandate. He promised that seeds of democracy would one day flourish again, even if he would not live to see it. His voice was solemn, heavy, yet strangely soothing, like a father saying farewell to his children. Outside the palace, the military tightened its grip. Tanks fired on the main entrances, soldiers stormed surrounding streets, and sharpshooters positioned themselves on rooftops. The balance of power was already clear, but the armed forces wanted to leave no doubt. Civilians caught near the palace were ordered to lie on the ground at gunpoint, while journalists were detained or forced away. Chile's capital, once bustling with ordinary life, had become a battlefield. As the flames spread through La Moneda, Allende gathered his closest circle in the presidential office. He thanked them for their loyalty and urged those who could escape to save themselves. Some did, slipping out through side doors or disguising themselves among civilians. Others chose to remain, unwilling to abandon their leader. In these final moments, the sense of history was palpable, as if everyone present understood that their lives were being folded into a chapter that would never be forgotten. By early afternoon, the palace was beyond saving. Fire consumed the upper floors, rubble blocked the hallways, and the air was thick with smoke. Gunfire echoed from outside, signalling the advancing troops. Within that inferno, Salvador Allende made his last stand, not through combat, but through the decision to meet death on his own terms. His passing marked the symbolic death of Chilean democracy itself, the closing of a century-long tradition of civilian rule. As soldiers finally entered the smouldering palace, they did not find a captured president. They found only silence, ash, and the weight of an ending that would haunt the nation for decades. When the soldiers finally secured La Moneda, the once proud palace stood in ruins. Its walls were blackened with soot, windows shattered, and corridors littered with rubble. The silence inside contrasted sharply with the chaos that had unfolded only hours earlier. For the military commanders, the coup had succeeded. President Allende was gone, and the seat of power lay firmly in their hands. But outside the palace, the real consequences of that day were only beginning to unfold. In the streets of Santiago, soldiers established checkpoints, their rifles pointed at civilians passing by. Loudspeakers announced curfews, while military trucks patrolled neighborhoods to enforce obedience. Fear replaced the sounds of daily life. Shops closed early, buses stopped running, and families gathered behind locked doors, whispering about what the future might hold. For many Chileans, it felt as though the country they had known had vanished overnight. Across the city, hundreds of government supporters, union leaders, and student activists were rounded up. Some were dragged from their homes, others seized in the middle of the street. They were taken to makeshift detention centres, stadiums, barracks, even schools converted into holding facilities. The most infamous of these became the National Stadium in Santiago, where thousands of detainees were kept under armed guard, waiting to learn their fate. Conditions inside the stadium were harsh. Prisoners sat on cold concrete floors, deprived of food, water, and basic sanitation. Soldiers barked orders, forcing detainees to line up for interrogations that often turned violent. Families outside waited desperately for news, uncertain whether their loved ones were alive or dead. The stadium, once a place of sports and music, had been transformed into a symbol of fear and repression. Meanwhile, the new military junta wasted no time consolidating its authority. Headed by General Pinochet, the junta dissolved Congress, suspended the constitution, and outlawed political parties. Censorship was imposed across radio, newspapers, and television, leaving only official voices in control of information. Overnight, freedom of expression, one of Chile's proudest traditions, was extinguished. For supporters of the coup, this was described as restoring order. For opponents, it was the end of democracy. In Washington and other foreign capitals, news of Allende's fall spread quickly. Some governments recognized the junta within days, while others expressed cautious concern. The Cold War lens colored every response. To the United States, the coup meant eliminating the threat of another Cuba. To the Soviet Union, it was a brutal reminder of capitalist intervention. But for ordinary Chileans, global politics mattered little in comparison to the immediate fear at home. September 11th had ended not just a presidency, but an entire way of life. As night fell on that first day of military rule, Santiago lay under a curfew, its streets empty except for patrols of soldiers and the occasional rumble of armoured vehicles. Families huddled together in silence, listening to the distant echoes of gunfire and explosions. For them, the day democracy died was not just history. It was the beginning of a long and uncertain darkness. In the days that followed September 11th, 1973, Santiago remained under the heavy grip of military rule. The city was quiet but tense, its silence broken only by the rumble of tanks and the footsteps of patrols. Curfew became the new rhythm of life, forcing families indoors before nightfall. Radios played only official statements, while newspapers carried identical headlines praising the restoration of order. Beneath this controlled surface, fear spread quickly. Neighbours whispered cautiously, never sure who might be listening, and once friendly conversations now ended in silence. Across the capital and into the provinces, the military launched coordinated raids against union offices, universities, and homes of suspected leftists. Thousands were detained within days, filling prisons and improvised camps. The National Stadium, once a place of celebration, became a holding centre where men and women were interrogated under blinding lights, their names recorded on lists that families were never allowed to see. Many detainees expected quick trials, but found instead endless waiting, their fates uncertain. Stories began to circulate of disappearances, people taken at night and never returned. Families searched desperately, lining up outside barracks, pleading for information. Mothers clutched photographs of sons and daughters, while fathers knocked on doors that never opened. The silence from authorities was deliberate. By refusing to confirm or deny, the junta created a climate where fear itself became a weapon. At the same time, the new rulers moved swiftly to dismantle the structures of democracy. Congress was dissolved, political parties banned, and strikes declared illegal. Universities were placed under military supervision, with professors dismissed and students expelled if suspected of sympathies for the old government. The arts and media, once vibrant, were censored, with books burned and music silenced if it carried the wrong message. Chile, known for its tradition of debate and cultural life, was suddenly stripped of its voice. For supporters of the coup, especially among business elites and conservative sectors, these measures brought relief. They believed the chaos of shortages and strikes was finally over, and that discipline would bring prosperity. But for the majority of Chileans, daily life grew harsher. Food remained scarce, inflation worsened, and fear of repression overshadowed every household. Abroad, the world reacted with shock and division. Some governments recognized the junta quickly, citing the need for stability, while others condemned the violence. International newspapers published photos of the burning palace, sparking debates about democracy, intervention, and human rights. But for ordinary Chileans, global arguments felt distant. Their reality was shaped by checkpoints, curfews, and the constant uncertainty of who might vanish next. September 11th had not been a single day of violence. It had opened the door to an entirely new era, where silence ruled and the shadow of repression stretched into every corner of the nation. The first weeks after the coup reshaped Chile with a speed that stunned even those who had expected change. The junta moved quickly to consolidate its grip, issuing decrees that replaced the old democratic framework with military command. Political parties across the spectrum were outlawed, their offices sealed and leaders hunted. Newspapers that once criticised the government were either silenced or forced to print only official statements. The free press, which had long been a cornerstone of Chilean life, vanished almost overnight. On the streets, soldiers carried out patrols with stern efficiency. Entire neighbourhoods were raided when even a rumour of resistance surfaced. Men were taken away in trucks, often blindfolded, while women stood helplessly at their doors. In rural towns, peasants who had benefited from land reforms were suddenly accused of being subversives, their plots seized back by former landowners with the backing of the army. The sense of reversal was overwhelming, as if years of social struggle had been erased in days. Universities, once hotbeds of political debate, became silent halls patrolled by armed guards. Professors who had spoken in favour of reform disappeared or fled into exile. Students faced interrogations and many never returned to their studies. Chile's intellectual and cultural life suffered a blow that would take decades to heal. Meanwhile, the junta proclaimed a mission of national reconstruction, insisting that its measures were temporary and necessary to save the country. General Pinochet appeared on television, presenting himself as a reluctant leader burdened with restoring order. His calm, measured tone contrasted with the violence on the streets, and some Chileans clung to his words as reassurance. Yet behind the controlled image, systematic repression deepened. Reports of torture began to emerge from detention centres. Survivors spoke of electric shocks, beatings, and psychological torment designed to break the will of prisoners. Most Chileans did not hear these accounts immediately, but whispers spread among families and neighbourhoods, adding to the atmosphere of dread. Exile became the only escape for many. Politicians, artists, and union leaders fled to Argentina, Mexico, or Europe, carrying with them stories of what was happening back home. They formed networks abroad, raising awareness and lobbying for support, while inside Chile, voices of dissent were silenced. Daily life became a balancing act between survival and silence. Parents taught their children not to repeat conversations outside the home. Teachers avoided political subjects in classrooms, and workers kept their heads down. Fear had become part of the national fabric. The dream of a peaceful road to socialism had ended in flames, and the democratic traditions Chileans once took for granted were replaced by a system where power flowed only from the barrel of a gun. The junta promised stability, but what it delivered was control, tight, unyielding, and absolute. By October 1973, the machinery of the new regime was fully in motion. Chile was no longer the land of democratic debate it had been only months before. It had become a nation ruled by decree, silence, and fear. Soldiers stood at every corner in Santiago, their presence a constant reminder that daily life was now under military watch. Curfews remained strict, and entire districts went dark at night except for the sweep of headlights from patrol vehicles. The once bustling evenings of music, theatre, and political discussion had been replaced by an enforced stillness. The National Stadium continued to serve as a symbol of repression. Thousands of detainees were still held there, sleeping under bleachers or in hallways, uncertain whether they would ever see freedom again. The atmosphere was filled with confusion, exhaustion, and fear as interrogations were carried out daily. Families gathered outside the stadium gates, some holding candles, others carrying letters, desperate for any word. Guards offered little more than shrugs or cold silence. Some detainees were released, shaken but alive, while others simply vanished without explanation. Beyond Santiago, the countryside also felt the heavy hand of the junta. In villages that had once embraced agrarian reform, peasants saw land redistributed back to landlords. Military patrols entered rural areas, rounding up suspected activists and leaving behind communities fractured by fear. Farmers who had celebrated their newfound independence found themselves once again under the control of powerful landowners, this time backed by rifles. Economically, the junta claimed it was bringing order, but the reality was harsher. Prices of goods remained unstable, and many families struggled to feed themselves. International loans and aid began to flow back into Chile, but these benefits were slow to reach ordinary people. Instead, they primarily reassured the elites and businesses that the old order was returning. Meanwhile, censorship tightened further. Books deemed subversive were removed from libraries, radio stations played only approved content, and television became a mouthpiece for the regime. Popular songs that had once echoed in plazas were banned, replaced by military marches and official anthems. Art, poetry, and even humour were carefully watched, as if any form of creativity might spark dissent. In the shadows of this repression, acts of resistance began to appear. Underground newspapers circulated secretly, handwritten or typed on smuggled machines. Small groups of students gathered at night to share ideas, whispering about justice and freedom. Though their reach was limited, these gestures of defiance kept alive a spark of hope that Chile had not completely surrendered to fear. Yet the risks were enormous. A careless word or misplaced leaflet could mean arrest, torture, or disappearance. For most Chileans, survival required silence. In kitchens, families lowered their voices, reminding children never to repeat what was said at home. The boundaries of safety had shrunk to the walls of one's own house, and even there, safety was uncertain. The new Chile was orderly on the surface, but beneath that order lay a deep wound that continued to bleed. As 1973 drew toward its end, Chileans began to realize that the junta was not a temporary measure, but a new reality. At first, some believed the military might stabilize the country and eventually restore elections, but with each passing week that illusion faded. General Pinochet and the other leaders made clear that they considered their rule indefinite. Decrees replaced laws, and military orders replaced debate. Chile had stepped into a prolonged period of authoritarian control. In neighbourhoods across Santiago, life adjusted uneasily to the new rhythms. Curfews shaped daily routines, and people learned to plan every activity before nightfall. The sound of boots on pavement became familiar, and the sight of soldiers inspecting identification cards was part of ordinary life. Shops reopened under strict rules, though shortages continued. Housewives still stood in long lines, but now they did so in silence, wary of speaking to strangers. Even children felt the shift. their schools now monitored, their teachers cautious in what subjects could be discussed. At universities, classrooms were half empty. Many students had gone into exile, while others were detained or living in hiding. Professors who had once inspired debates on politics or philosophy had disappeared from lecture halls, replaced by silence or by officials who discouraged questioning. The intellectual spark that had once defined Chilean education dimmed under constant surveillance. Meanwhile, the machinery of repression expanded. Detention centres spread beyond the capital, and new names appeared on lists of the missing. The term disappeared became common in conversations, spoken softly, with fear. Families placed photos of their loved ones on church doors, or passed them quietly from hand to hand, seeking information in a country where information itself had become dangerous. Economically, the junta pushed policies intended to reverse Allende's reforms. Industries were privatised, foreign companies encouraged to return, and land redistributed back to elites. International creditors once again favoured Chile, offering loans and trade. But these measures brought little relief to workers. Unemployment rose, wages fell, and inequality deepened. For many, the promise of stability translated into harsher poverty. Abroad, Chile's situation became a symbol of Cold War struggles. Some governments condemned the coup, cutting ties or offering asylum to refugees. Others embraced the junta, seeing it as a barrier against socialism. Exiled Chileans carried their stories overseas, describing arrests, torture, and censorship. Their voices spread awareness, but inside Chile those same voices were silenced. Still, even in this atmosphere of fear, small forms of resistance endured. Secret meetings in basements, coded graffiti on walls, and smuggled pamphlets kept alive the hope that democracy was not entirely dead. These acts were fragile, but they reminded Chileans that silence was not absolute. Beneath the shadow of dictatorship, whispers of defiance survived, like faint embers refusing to die out. By early 1974, Chileans were living under a system where daily survival depended on silence. The routines of repression became ordinary. Curfews, inspections, and the quiet disappearance of neighbours. Families learned to guard their words even at dinner tables, teaching children not to repeat conversations outside. Trust was fragile. Even lifelong friends hesitated before speaking openly. The junta had not only seized power, it had reshaped the psychology of a nation. In the countryside, the shift was equally profound. Land reforms from Allende's era were rolled back, and peasants who had once received land now faced eviction. Soldiers enforced the return of estates to wealthy owners, and entire communities were displaced. Resentment grew quietly, but few dared to speak. The risk of arrest or worse outweighed the desire for protest. Instead, anger simmered in silence, passed from parents to children like a guarded inheritance. Meanwhile, the National Stadium continued to symbolise fear. Detainees there numbered in the thousands, though many were gradually transferred to prisons or secret facilities. Those released emerged gaunt and shaken, often refusing to describe what they had endured. Rumours of torture spread nonetheless, stories of electric shocks, isolation, and endless interrogations whispered in kitchens or shared in hurried walks home. The stadium had become a dark monument, remembered not for sports, but for suffering. Economically, the junta deepened its commitment to free market reforms. Advisors influenced by international economists began reshaping policy, reducing state control and opening markets. Supporters claimed these measures would modernize Chile, but in the short term, they caused hardship. Prices soared after subsidies were removed, and many families who had struggled during Allende's years now found themselves in deeper poverty. Long lines for food gave way to empty pockets and the harsh reality of unemployment. Abroad, Chile's situation drew mixed reactions. Exiles in Europe and Latin America organised rallies, speaking of repression and lost freedoms. They published articles, recorded testimonies, and lobbied governments to pressure the junta. At the same time, the United States and several allies praised Chile's return to order, providing loans and diplomatic recognition. These divided responses mirrored the global Cold War landscape, where human rights often ranked below ideology. Despite the climate of fear, resistance did not vanish. Underground groups began to form networks, distributing secret newsletters and organising safe houses for those hunted by the regime. Churches played a subtle but important role, offering sanctuary and humanitarian aid. Priests and nuns risked punishment by hiding activists or documenting abuses. Their courage reminded Chileans that not all institutions had surrendered, yet the risks were immense. A single misstep could mean prison or disappearance. For most citizens, hope became a quiet act, lighting a candle in church, keeping a hidden photo of a loved one, or whispering a promise that freedom would return. Beneath the heavy silence of dictatorship, those small acts carried weight, sustaining the memory of a democracy that had not been entirely erased. By mid-1974, the military junta no longer portrayed itself as a temporary caretaker. General Pinochet emerged as the undisputed leader, consolidating power within the army and marginalizing rivals. His image began to appear in official broadcasts and newspapers, presented as the stern but steady hand guiding Chile through reconstruction. The transition from collective junta to personal rule was subtle at first, but by the year's end it was undeniable. Chile had entered the era of Pinochet's dictatorship. For ordinary Chileans, the changes were felt in daily routines more than in speeches. Identification checks multiplied, and new regulations dictated even small details of life, from business permits to travel permissions. Families of the disappeared organised quietly, seeking answers, though authorities rarely acknowledged their pleas. Posters with photos of missing sons and daughters appeared on church doors, only to be torn down by soldiers hours later. Each torn poster symbolised not just loss, but the regime's refusal to recognise it. Economically, reforms accelerated. State-owned companies were privatised, and markets opened to foreign investors. A group of young economists, later known as the Chicago Boys, introduced policies aimed at curbing inflation and modernising Chile. Supporters pointed to eventual stability, but in 1974 the cost was severe. Wages stagnated, unemployment rose, and the poorest communities bore the weight of adjustment. For those already struggling after years of crisis, the new system offered little relief. Internationally, Chile's image shifted dramatically. Reports of human rights abuses began to circulate widely, carried by exiles and sympathetic journalists. Governments in Scandinavia and parts of Europe denounced the dictatorship, offering asylum to refugees. Yet other nations, including the United States, provided support, valuing Chile's alignment against socialism. In this divided world, Chile became both a warning and an example, depending on the lens through which it was viewed. Resistance persisted in small, cautious forms. Underground newspapers carried coded messages, while musicians composed songs in exile that were smuggled back into the country. Churches organised soup kitchens and legal aid for families of prisoners. These actions, though limited, provided glimmers of solidarity in a society where fear was otherwise dominant. The junta's response was predictable: harsher crackdowns, tighter censorship, and an ever-expanding network of secret police. Chile's landscape of 1974 was one of outward discipline but inner fracture. Beneath the silence of military order, grief, anger, and resilience coexisted, shaping a hidden current that would endure through the long years ahead. By 1975, Chile had settled uneasily into the structures of dictatorship. The initial shock of the coup had passed, but the atmosphere of fear remained thick, woven into daily life like an invisible net. Soldiers no longer needed to display force constantly. The memory of September 11th and the stories of arrests were enough to keep most people silent. Families adapted to the new normal, planning shopping trips around curfew, lowering their voices in public, and reminding children never to repeat what they heard at home. For many, survival depended on silence, Economically, the regime deepened its market reforms. The Chicago Boys pushed forward policies of liberalization, cutting subsidies, and privatizing industries. Inflation, once uncontrollable, began to slow, but unemployment soared. Factories closed, and thousands of workers found themselves without jobs. Middle-class families saw their savings eroded, while the wealthy regained privileges lost under Allende. Supporters of the junta praised these measures as necessary modernization. Critics saw only widening inequality. In rural areas, life grew harsher. Land once distributed to peasants was now reclaimed by former owners, often backed by military force. Families who had briefly tasted independence were reduced again to labourers. Entire communities fragmented as young people left for cities or exile abroad. The promise of reform that had energized the countryside during Allende's years had vanished, replaced by resignation and bitterness. At universities, the intellectual climate was suffocated. Professors suspected of dissent were dismissed. Students faced constant surveillance, and libraries were cleansed of books labelled subversive. Yet beneath this silence, seeds of resistance persisted. Secret study circles gathered in private homes, passing photocopied texts and discussing banned ideas. For those involved, it was less about immediate rebellion than about keeping alive the memory of free thought. Internationally, the picture of Chile became clearer. Reports of torture and disappearances reached human rights organizations, sparking campaigns of denunciation. Exiled Chileans organized marches in cities like Paris, Stockholm, and Mexico City, carrying photos of the missing and chanting for freedom. Their voices clashed with official Chilean embassies, which insisted on stability and progress. The contradiction between polished propaganda and lived reality grew sharper with every passing month. Inside Chile, the Catholic Church began to play a cautious but important role. Through the Vicariate of Solidarity, priests and volunteers provided legal assistance to families of detainees, documented abuses, and offered humanitarian aid. Though limited in reach, these actions gave hope to thousands. They also marked one of the few institutions willing to stand, however carefully, against the regime. By the end of 1975, Chile was a country transformed, outwardly orderly, inwardly scarred. The old traditions of debate and pluralism were gone, replaced by decrees and fear. Yet under the surface, small sparks of defiance, exiles abroad, church networks at home, whispers in classrooms, reminded Chileans that silence was not the same as acceptance. The dictatorship was strong, but the memory of democracy still lingered like an ember waiting to be fanned into flame. By 1976, Pinochet's rule had settled into a routine of absolute authority. His image, once cautious, was now everywhere. Portraits in government buildings, speeches broadcast regularly, and his name invoked as the guardian of Chile's order. Yet behind this carefully built image, the machinery of repression expanded with precision. The creation of DINA, the secret police, marked a turning point. This agency, operating beyond normal laws, tracked dissidents with ruthless efficiency. Homes were raided at night, activists disappeared without trace, and whispers of torture centres grew louder. Fear was no longer random, it was systematic. The National Stadium was no longer the sole symbol of detention. Ordinary houses, converted apartments, and hidden facilities became places where interrogations took place. Survivors later recalled rooms without windows, electric wires, and endless hours of questioning. Many never spoke of their experiences, but scars, both physical and psychological, remained. Families searched desperately, filing petitions, writing letters, or appealing to the church. Rarely did they receive answers. The word desaparecido, the disappeared, entered Chile's vocabulary, a painful reminder of lives erased without explanation. At the same time, the regime promoted its vision of progress. Official broadcasts praised economic reforms, presenting graphs of declining inflation and promises of future growth. Business leaders regained confidence, and foreign investors slowly returned. Yet for ordinary citizens, daily life remained hard. Prices of basic goods were unstable, jobs scarce, and inequality visible on every street. The wealthy neighborhoods of Santiago prospered, while poorer districts struggled with hunger and unemployment. This divide grew wider with each passing year. Resistance, though dangerous, did not vanish. Small underground groups organized secret printing presses, producing leaflets that circulated hand to hand. Musicians wrote coded lyrics, poets crafted verses that spoke of loss and hope, and painters embedded messages in their art. For many, creativity became a quiet weapon, a way of keeping memory alive in the face of enforced silence. Abroad, Chile's image darkened further. Reports of torture reached international organizations, and human rights groups began campaigns of denunciation. Demonstrations outside Chilean embassies became more frequent, with exiled Chileans carrying banners of the missing. The regime responded by dismissing these stories as lies, but the evidence was growing too strong to ignore. The Catholic Church's Vicariate of Solidarity expanded its work, documenting cases and providing aid. Though constantly pressured, it became a rare refuge for victims and their families. For many Chileans, simply walking into its offices was an act of courage. By the close of 1976, Chile was firmly under dictatorship, its institutions reshaped, its culture muted. Yet in the quiet acts of resistance, in whispered prayers, in hidden photographs of the disappeared, a different Chile endured, silent, wounded, but still alive beneath the weight of fear. By 1977, the dictatorship had entered its fourth year, and the sense of permanence was undeniable. Pinochet no longer spoke of transition or temporary rule. His speeches declared the junta as the new institutional order of Chile. The constitution was suspended, elections erased from the calendar, and the military filled every level of government. Chile had ceased to be a democracy in any recognizable sense. For ordinary citizens, the shock of those first years had hardened into a heavy routine. Fear was constant, but it had become normalized. People went to work, queued for food, and whispered their frustrations in kitchens or on late-night walks, but always with caution. Silence was a skill, passed on like a survival tool. Children learned early to recognize the sound of boots in the street, or to stop talking if a stranger entered the room. At the same time, the reach of the regime deepened through international networks. Operation Condor, a secret alliance of South American dictatorships, coordinated intelligence and repression across borders. Chilean exiles in Argentina or Uruguay discovered they were not safe. Agents tracked, kidnapped, and sometimes eliminated them far from home. The shadow of Chile's dictatorship extended beyond its own territory, binding together a continent of fear. Economically, the regime promoted its successes loudly. Inflation, once rampant, was curbed, and GDP showed signs of growth. Foreign investment increased, and the government showcased modern infrastructure projects. Yet beneath these statistics, unemployment soared and poverty deepened. Many families survived only through informal work or by relying on extended relatives. For those in the poor districts of Santiago or rural villages, the so-called miracle felt like an illusion. Meanwhile, culture adapted in subtle ways. Songs of resistance were banned, but melodies carried quietly in private gatherings. Writers disguised political criticism in allegories and children's stories. Theatre groups performed plays with double meanings, where audiences understood what censors missed. In these coded messages, Chileans found a fragile space for expression. Abroad, human rights organizations grew louder in their denunciations. Testimonies of torture and disappearance reached the United Nations, prompting debates and resolutions. Countries in Europe began to restrict arms sales and offer refuge to Chilean exiles. Yet support from the United States continued, tied to the logic of Cold War strategy. Pinochet presented himself as a reliable ally against communism, and that was enough to secure backing. Inside Chile, the Catholic Church remained one of the few voices offering protection. The Vicariate of Solidarity expanded its files, documenting thousands of cases of abuse. Each folder represented a life, a family, a cry for justice carefully recorded in a time when official institutions refused to listen. By the end of 1977, Chile was a country outwardly calm but inwardly fractured. The streets were quiet, businesses functioned, and schools operated. Yet beneath this surface lay unspoken grief. The memory of democracy lingered like an echo, carried in whispers and in the determined silence of those who refused to forget. By 1978, the dictatorship's hold on Chile felt immovable. General Pinochet stood not just as the head of a junta, but as the unquestioned figure of authority, his image carefully managed in official broadcasts and ceremonies. Military parades filled the streets, projecting discipline and power, while the silence of dissent revealed the cost behind that order. The state of emergency that had once been described as temporary was now a permanent condition of life. For many Chileans, resignation replaced hope. Daily life carried on. Buses ran, markets opened, children went to school. But beneath this surface was an awareness that freedom was absent. Curfews continued to dictate evenings, and the presence of soldiers at checkpoints remained a daily reminder of control. Families of the disappeared organised discreetly, gathering in churches or private homes. They carried photos of loved ones, sometimes holding small vigils, but always under the watchful eyes of the authorities. Their persistence kept memory alive, even as official channels denied their existence. Economically, the government promoted its achievements with pride. Inflation was stabilized, and foreign investors praised Chile's new openness. Yet the benefits were uneven. Wealth concentrated in elite neighborhoods, while poverty deepened in working-class districts. Soup kitchens organized by churches fed many who could no longer afford basic meals. The so-called miracle was visible in numbers, but invisible in the lives of those who suffered most. Internationally, Chile faced increasing criticism. Reports of human rights abuses could no longer be ignored, as exiled Chileans testified before international organizations. European governments condemned the repression, while Latin American dictatorships offered cooperation under Operation Condor. The Cold War context still shielded Pinochet in Washington, where his anti-communist stance outweighed concerns over abuses. Resistance at home adapted in careful, creative ways. Writers used allegory, musicians coded messages into songs, and graffiti appeared on walls during the night, quickly erased by morning but always returning. Each small act carried risk, but also hope. The Catholic Church's Vicariate of Solidarity continued its quiet work, documenting abuses and offering aid. Their offices became sanctuaries for those with nowhere else to turn. For many, stepping inside was the only moment of safety they would know. By the end of 1978, Chile was a nation where silence dominated, but memory persisted. Beneath the outward calm, grief and quiet defiance endured, shaping a hidden current of resistance that refused to die, even in the darkest years of dictatorship. By 1979, the Chilean dictatorship had become deeply rooted, with its structures woven into every aspect of life. General Pinochet no longer shared authority with other officers in appearance. His dominance was clear, his speeches confident, and his control unchallenged. The junta projected strength through ceremonies, military parades, and patriotic festivals, creating an image of national unity. Yet behind the spectacle, ordinary Chileans lived with the constant shadow of repression. Families of the disappeared grew more organized, forming small groups that later became known as the Mothers of the Disappeared. They gathered outside churches or quietly marched with photos of their loved ones pinned to their clothing. Though modest in size, these demonstrations carried profound symbolism. Each face represented not just a missing person, but a silent story. The authorities often dispersed them quickly, yet their persistence left an indelible mark. Economically, the regime promoted Chile as a model of modern reform. Market liberalization, privatization, and foreign investment were praised in official broadcasts. Indeed, some sectors of the economy showed signs of recovery. Inflation was under control and exports increased, particularly in copper. However, the social cost remained heavy. Unemployment rates hovered high, wages lagged, and the gap between rich and poor widened sharply. In working-class neighbourhoods, hardship was visible in empty refrigerators and lines at soup kitchens. Supporters of the regime called these sacrifices necessary steps toward progress, but for the majority, survival became the daily struggle. Culturally, censorship still defined the landscape. Books, songs and plays with even indirect political messages were banned. Yet art continued to find secret paths. Poets disguised protest in metaphors. Musicians recorded songs abroad that were smuggled back into Chile, and visual artists embedded subtle criticism in exhibitions that passed official review. Creativity became both shield and weapon, a quiet reminder that thought could not be fully controlled. Internationally, criticism of Pinochet's government grew sharper. Amnesty International and the United Nations recorded testimonies of torture and disappearances, keeping global attention on Chile's plight. Some governments applied diplomatic pressure, while others maintained alliances for strategic reasons. Chile became a symbol in Cold War debates. For some, a bastion of anti-communism. For others, an emblem of human rights violations. Within Chile, resistance adapted to these realities. Underground networks circulated pamphlets, organised safe houses, and spread news through word of mouth. The Catholic Church's vicariate of solidarity expanded its reach, offering legal aid, food, and spiritual comfort to thousands. Though constantly under threat, its presence gave people a fragile but vital sense of hope. By the end of 1979, Chile stood as a country outwardly calm, its economy praised abroad, but inside scarred by fear and inequality. The silence imposed by dictatorship was heavy, but it could not erase memory. Beneath the surface, quiet resistance endured, waiting for a moment when it might once again rise into the open. Entering the 1980s, Chile was firmly under Pinochet's control, yet the dictatorship sought to cement its authority through more permanent means. In September 1980, a new constitution was pushed through a tightly controlled plebiscite. Official figures claimed overwhelming approval, but reports of irregularities and intimidation left many skeptical. Regardless of its legitimacy, the document granted Pinochet extended powers and set the stage for his continued rule well into the following decade. The plebiscite became both a legal shield and a political weapon, ensuring that the framework of dictatorship was written into the nation's laws. For ordinary Chileans, the constitution changed little in daily routines. Curfews still shaped nights, censorship silenced voices, and fear guided conversations. Yet the symbolic weight was immense. Democracy was not only absent in practice, but erased from the legal structure itself. Families of the disappeared continued their quiet protests, holding vigils, walking with photos and demanding truth. Their persistence challenged the official narrative that denied abuses. Each march, though small, chipped at the wall of silence, reminding Chileans that memory could not be legislated away. Economically, the government celebrated signs of growth. Inflation had been tamed, exports increased, and Santiago's wealthier districts displayed new prosperity. Yet beneath the polished surface, unemployment remained high and poverty deepened. Entire families lived on the margins, supported by church-run soup kitchens or community aid. The divide between the official image of success and the lived reality of hardship widened with each passing year. Internationally, the 1980 Constitution drew criticism. Human rights organisations condemned the plebiscite as fraudulent, while supportive governments praised it as stability. Exiled Chileans organised campaigns abroad, distributing leaflets, speaking at universities, and holding demonstrations in front of embassies. Their voices kept Chile's struggle visible, even when repression inside the country limited open dissent. Resistance within Chile adapted to new forms. Underground presses circulated newsletters that mocked the plebiscite, while artists embedded hidden symbols of protest in their work. Churches offered space for meetings disguised as religious gatherings, providing cover for discussions about rights and justice. Every small act carried risk, but it also reminded people that not all voices had been silenced. By the end of 1980, Chile was a nation locked between appearances and reality. On paper, the constitution promised order and legitimacy. In practice, it entrenched fear and inequality. Yet within homes, churches, and secret gatherings, the belief in democracy endured, waiting for the moment when it might once again step into the open sunlight. By 1981, the Chilean dictatorship stood outwardly strong, yet beneath the surface cracks began to appear. The new constitution had given Pinochet legal authority to rule, but it could not erase the memory of repression or the daily struggles of ordinary people. The economy, praised abroad as a model, showed signs of fragility. Unemployment was still high, and while elite neighbourhoods of Santiago prospered, working-class districts endured hardship. Soup kitchens organised by churches became lifelines for families. For many, survival meant relying on charity rather than wages. The disparity between official statistics and lived reality deepened mistrust. Families of the disappeared continued their silent marches. Mothers stood in church courtyards, holding photos of missing sons, their quiet persistence a painful contrast to the government's denial. Soldiers often dispersed them, yet their presence could not be erased. Each photograph raised a question the regime refused to answer. Resistance also grew in subtle forms. Leaflets appeared in markets, graffiti on walls proclaimed democracy will return, and underground radio broadcasts crackled with news banned from official channels. These gestures were small, but they carried enormous risk. Discovery meant arrest, and arrest often meant disappearance. Still, people found ways to resist, proving that silence was not absolute. Internationally, criticism of Chile mounted. Human rights groups documented cases of torture and killings, and exiled Chileans spoke at universities and rallies abroad. Their testimonies gave faces and names to statistics, building global awareness of what was happening behind closed doors. Some governments began to distance themselves, though Cold War politics still shielded Pinochet from complete isolation. Inside Chile, culture adapted under censorship. Writers cloaked political critique in allegories, musicians used metaphors, and theatre companies staged plays with hidden meanings. Audiences understood, finding solidarity in these coded messages. Art became a form of quiet defiance, a reminder that thought could not be fully controlled. By the end of 1981, Chile was a country suspended between fear and endurance. The dictatorship projected confidence, but beneath the surface people carried grief, anger, and hope. The memory of democracy lingered like a quiet heartbeat, steady even under the weight of silence. In 1982, Chile faced a crisis that shook even the foundations of the dictatorship, the collapse of its economy. Years of liberalisation and dependence on foreign loans had left the country vulnerable, and when the global recession struck, Chile was hit hard. Banks failed, industries shut down, and unemployment soared above 30%. Families that had already struggled now found themselves in desperation. Soup kitchens multiplied in working-class neighbourhoods, while long lines for food stretched down city blocks. The economic miracle the regime had boasted about turned into a nightmare for millions. Pinochet's government responded with strict control, but discontent was no longer hidden. For the first time since the coup, protests returned to the streets in visible numbers. Workers, students, and even middle-class families began organising days of protest, known as Jornadas de Protesta Nacional. These demonstrations started cautiously, with banging pots and pans from balconies at night, but soon spilled into marches, barricades, and clashes with police. The sight of ordinary Chileans openly defying curfew marked a turning point. the dictatorship answered with force. Riot police flooded neighbourhoods, firing tear gas and rubber bullets, while soldiers patrolled to intimidate protesters. Arrests were widespread, yet repression could not erase the growing unrest. For many Chileans, the economic collapse revealed the limits of fear. Hunger and hardship pushed them into action. Internationally, Chile's image darkened further. Reports of violent crackdowns spread, and global media carried photos of armoured vehicles facing unarmed demonstrators. Human rights organisations renewed pressure, highlighting both economic mismanagement and repression. Exiled Chileans abroad organised solidarity marches, amplifying the voices of those protesting at home. Within Chile, the Catholic Church once again provided space for resistance. Churches sheltered demonstrators fleeing police, organised community aid, and gave moral support to families of detainees. Priests and nuns walked alongside protesters, documenting abuses. Their presence lent legitimacy to the movement and reassured participants that they were not entirely alone. By the end of 1982, Chile was no longer silent. Fear still hung heavily, but the sound of banging pots echoed across Santiago and beyond. For the first time in nearly a decade, the dictatorship faced not only whispers of dissent, but the open defiance of thousands. Though the regime remained strong, the tide of resistance had begun to rise. By 1983, the protests that began with banging pots had grown into a national movement. What started as scattered acts of defiance evolved into organised jornadas de protesta, days when entire communities coordinated demonstrations. Streets filled with chants, banners, and barricades made of burning tyres. Students marched from universities, workers left factories, and families stood on balconies clanging metal pans in unison. The sound echoed across Santiago like a collective heartbeat, declaring that silence had ended. The regime responded with its usual weapon, fear. Tanks rolled into neighbourhoods, riot police fired tear gas, and soldiers arrested hundreds. Yet unlike earlier years, repression no longer guaranteed obedience. Each protest returned stronger, fueled by frustration with economic collapse and years of injustice. The sight of young people facing armed troops with nothing but banners and voices became a powerful symbol of courage. In working-class barrios, resistance spread like wildfire. Murals appeared on walls painted quickly at night, proclaiming democracy will return. Pamphlets circulated secretly, telling stories of the disappeared and calling for unity. These acts carried immense risk, but the willingness of thousands to participate made it harder for the junta to suppress. The Catholic Church continued its vital role, opening doors to demonstrators and mediating between families and the authorities. Community kitchens, organised by parishes, fed entire neighbourhoods, turning survival itself into a form of resistance. The Church's insistence on human dignity gave moral strength to a population long silenced by fear. International attention intensified. Foreign journalists captured images of protests and repression, broadcasting them worldwide. Human rights groups documented abuses, while exiled Chileans amplified the stories abroad. Sanctions and diplomatic pressure mounted, and Chile's regime found itself increasingly isolated. Even traditional allies began to question the cost of association with Pinochet. Inside Chile, opposition groups started to find one another. Political parties, once banned, reconnected underground, forming alliances with unions and student movements. Though fragmented by years of repression, a common demand united them: the end of dictatorship. By late 1983, the junta faced not only economic instability, but also a growing wave of organised dissent. The protests did not topple the regime, but they cracked its aura of invincibility. For the first time since 1973, Chileans could imagine change. The road ahead remained long and dangerous, yet the sound of clanging pots and the sight of crowded streets carried a promise. The memory of democracy had not been extinguished, and the people were ready to claim it again. By 1984, Chile's wave of protest showed no sign of fading. Demonstrations spread beyond Santiago into provincial towns, where workers, students, and families joined the national calls for change. Even in rural areas once considered loyal to the regime, people organised cacerolazos, nightly pot-banging that carried across the fields like echoes of defiance. The sound was simple yet powerful, uniting voices without speeches or banners. Each metallic rhythm was a reminder that fear no longer silenced the nation. The government escalated its response. States of emergency were declared repeatedly, granting the military sweeping powers. Armoured vehicles patrolled city streets, and checkpoints multiplied. Entire neighbourhoods were raided after protests, with young men rounded up indiscriminately. Yet repression no longer erased dissent, it only deepened anger. Families who once remained cautious now joined marches, realising that silence offered no protection. The Catholic Church remained a pillar of support. Through the vicariate of solidarity, it provided food, legal aid and protection for victims. Priests recorded testimonies of torture, preserving evidence that would one day become vital. Church-run community kitchens fed thousands, turning charity into resistance. For many Chileans, the church was the only institution that dared to confront the dictatorship's abuses directly. Politically, underground movements grew bolder. Opposition parties, fragmented since the coup, began forming alliances to demand democratic reforms. Meetings were held in secret apartments, with curtains drawn and whispers replacing speeches. Leaders drafted proposals for transition, though unity was fragile. Some wanted gradual reform while others demanded immediate overthrow. Still, the very act of coordination was a sign of growing strength. International pressure also mounted. Exiled Chileans organised demonstrations in capitals across Europe and Latin America, carrying photos of the disappeared and chanting for democracy. Human rights organisations amplified their voices, publishing detailed reports that exposed the regime's brutality. Foreign governments, once silent, began to impose restrictions and sanctions, increasing the junta's isolation. Despite all this, Pinochet showed no intention of stepping down. In public speeches, he dismissed protesters as agitators and insisted that his government was saving Chile from chaos. His words carried less weight than before, but his control of the military remained unshaken. By the end of 1984, Chile was caught in a tense balance. The streets belonged to protesters by day and soldiers by night. Fear still existed, but it no longer commanded obedience. For the first time in more than a decade, the possibility of change felt tangible, carried in chants, painted on walls, and hammered into the night by the steady rhythm of pots and pans. By 1985, Chile's resistance had matured into a nationwide movement. The protests of earlier years, once sporadic, became organised campaigns, bringing together students, unions, political parties, and neighbourhood groups. Demonstrations filled city squares, banners stretched across streets, and chants for democracy echoed against the walls of Santiago. Even under tear gas and armoured vehicles, the spirit of defiance grew stronger. What had once been whispers now roared openly, demanding an end to dictatorship. The regime, sensing the pressure, attempted to project control. Pinochet tightened emergency laws and relied heavily on the military to suppress dissent. Police units patrolled universities, raided union offices, and arrested leaders of community organisations. Yet each crackdown failed to silence opposition. Instead, martyrs of the movement, those arrested, beaten, or disappeared, became symbols that inspired even more resistance. Neighbourhoods organised themselves in new ways. Committees distributed food, coordinated protests, and kept watch for security forces. In poor barrios, walls became canvases for murals that celebrated unity and remembered the missing. Art, once censored, re-emerged in colours of defiance. Music from exiled Chileans was secretly played at gatherings, reminding listeners that the struggle was part of something larger. The Catholic Church's influence deepened as it shielded activists and documented abuses. Priests offered sanctuary, lawyers associated with the Church defended detainees, and its publications quietly circulated information the state tried to suppress. The Church's credibility provided protection when none else existed. Internationally, pressure intensified. Reports from Amnesty International and the United Nations highlighted systemic torture and killings. Foreign governments debated sanctions, while protests outside Chilean embassies grew louder. Exiles abroad became ambassadors of memory, their testimonies piercing through official propaganda. At the same time, diplomatic cracks began to show among Chile's allies. Some who once praised the regime's economic model grew uncomfortable with its human rights record. For Pinochet, maintaining power now meant defending not only at home, but also on the global stage. By the end of 1985, Chile stood at a crossroads. The dictatorship remained armed and determined, but its aura of invincibility was fractured. The people had found their voice again, uniting across generations and classes. In the rhythm of cacerolazos, in the painted slogans, and in the courage of those who marched despite danger, a new Chile was taking shape, one that carried the memory of democracy and the promise of its return. By 1986, Chile had reached a moment of heightened tension. The opposition, emboldened by years of protest, intensified its efforts, while the regime hardened its grip. That year became one of both hope and fear, marked by dramatic confrontations that revealed how close the struggle had come to a decisive point. Massive demonstrations filled the streets of Santiago and other cities. Students clashed with police, unions declared strikes, and nightly cacerolazos echoed from balconies. Barricades of burning tires lit the darkened neighborhoods, their flames reflecting the anger of a generation that had grown up entirely under dictatorship. Yet the regime responded with brutal force. Soldiers patrolled with live ammunition, riot police fired tear gas into crowds, and security forces conducted mass arrests. The cost of resistance was high, but the movement did not falter. In September 1986, the nation was stunned by an assassination attempt against Pinochet himself. His motorcade was ambushed outside Santiago by members of the armed resistance group Frente Patriótico Manuel Rodriguez. Several of his bodyguards were killed, but Pinochet escaped unharmed. The attack revealed the level of desperation among some sectors of the opposition, but it also gave the dictatorship an excuse to intensify repression. In the aftermath, hundreds were detained, and torture centres filled once again. The government used the incident to portray itself as the guardian of stability against terrorists, tightening its grip on society. Despite the repression, the opposition's broader movement continued to grow. Political parties, though still banned, operated underground, forming coalitions and drafting strategies for a future transition. Civil society organisations, from professional associations to student unions, provided infrastructure for dissent. Each active organisation, no matter how small, kept the vision of democracy alive. Internationally, the attempted assassination drew mixed reactions. Some governments condemned violence while still criticising the regime's repression. Human rights organisations emphasised that the underlying issue remained. Chileans had no peaceful path to political change. Exiles abroad amplified this message, holding rallies that linked Chile's struggle to global debates on human rights. By the end of 1986, Chile was a country balanced on a knife's edge. The dictatorship remained powerful, but the people's determination was stronger than ever. The hope for democracy no longer felt like a distant dream. It had become a demand shouted in the streets, painted on walls, and carried in the hearts of millions who refused to surrender. By 1987, the regime faced growing challenges both inside and outside Chile. Years of protest had weakened its image, and international pressure mounted steadily. Human rights organisations published reports that documented torture and disappearances in detail, while foreign governments debated how long they could support Pinochet without damaging their own credibility. Inside the country, the opposition gained momentum, finding ways to coordinate despite constant surveillance. Neighbourhood committees, student groups, and underground political networks began to work together more openly. Risk was still immense. Arrests and intimidation continued, but the sense of unity strengthened. Even in poor barrios where hardship was most severe, people organised food drives and cultural events that doubled as acts of defiance. Music, theatre and poetry became tools of resistance, carrying coded messages of hope and freedom. The Catholic Church continued to play a central role, expanding its humanitarian aid and offering safe spaces for meetings. Priests spoke carefully in sermons, weaving in messages about justice and dignity without directly naming the regime. Parish halls hosted workshops, legal aid sessions, and small forums where Chileans could imagine life beyond dictatorship. These gatherings built a sense of community, reminding people that they were not alone. Politically, opposition leaders worked to form a broader coalition. Though they came from different ideologies, Christian Democrats, socialists, liberals, they shared one goal: a peaceful transition to democracy. Secret talks produced agreements on how to act if the regime eventually allowed a vote. Their unity was fragile, tested by mistrust and years of division, but it marked the first real blueprint for change. Economically, inequality persisted. Official figures boasted of growth, yet unemployment and poverty haunted many districts. The contrast between shining storefronts in wealthy neighbourhoods and the hunger in working-class areas was stark. This visible divide fueled resentment and added energy to protests. Internationally, Chile grew more isolated. Demonstrations outside embassies increased, and foreign universities hosted exiled Chileans who told their stories to packed halls. The world's attention, once distracted, now focused sharply on Pinochet's rule. Pressure for reform came not only from activists but also from governments demanding a democratic process. By the end of 1987, the possibility of transition no longer seemed impossible. The regime still held power through weapons and fear, but the people's movement had gained confidence and organisation. Chile stood on the edge of a new chapter, with the promise of change beginning to feel within reach. By 1988, Chile had reached a decisive moment. Under growing international pressure and internal unrest, the regime announced a national plebiscite to decide whether Pinochet would remain in power for another 8 years. It was a gamble by the dictatorship, intended to legitimise itself with a controlled vote. Yet for the opposition, it became the first real chance in 15 years to challenge the regime through ballots instead of bullets. Preparation for the vote transformed the country. Opposition parties, once fragmented, united under the No campaign, urging Chileans to reject Pinochet's continuation. Their slogan was simple but powerful: Chile, la alegría ya viene. Chile, joy is coming. For the first time in years, television broadcasts carried messages of hope. Carefully produced spots showed families smiling, music playing, and images of a brighter future. The campaign struck a chord, contrasting with the dark imagery and warnings used by the regime's Yes campaign. On the streets, energy surged. Volunteers handed out flyers, painted murals, and organised rallies. People who had long been silent now spoke openly, encouraged by the possibility of peaceful change. The regime, though confident, grew uneasy. Security forces monitored rallies, but the size of the crowds made repression costly. For the first time, the junta had to tolerate a measure of public expression it could not fully control. Families of the disappeared marched with renewed determination, their photographs reminding Chileans of the human cost of dictatorship. Their presence gave moral weight to the No campaign, linking the promise of joy with the demand for justice. International observers also played a role. Governments, journalists, and human rights groups watched closely, determined to prevent fraud. Their attention pressured the regime to allow a vote that could be seen as credible. The Cold War lens had shifted. Pinochet was no longer untouchable. Economically, the divide remained sharp. The wealthy pointed to growth and stability as reasons to vote yes, while the poor, bearing the brunt of inequality, leaned toward no. This division reflected the broader conflict. One side clinging to order built on fear, the other yearning for democracy. As the plebiscite approached, tension gripped Chile. Posters covered walls, debates filled homes, and hope mixed with anxiety. For many, casting a vote felt like a dangerous act, but it also carried the promise of reclaiming a voice silenced for too long. The dictatorship that had begun with fire and tanks now faced its greatest test, the ballot box. On October 5, 1988, Chile held the plebiscite that would determine its future. For weeks, tension had built across the nation. The Yes campaign promised continuity, portraying Pinochet as the guardian of stability. The No campaign, meanwhile, offered hope, joy, and the promise of democracy restored. Both sides filled the airwaves with messages, but on the morning of the vote, what mattered was not speeches or slogans. It was the courage of ordinary citizens to mark a ballot. Polling stations opened under heavy military presence. Soldiers stood nearby, their rifles visible, a silent reminder of who still held power. Yet despite the intimidation, long lines formed. People waited patiently, some carrying umbrellas against the sun, others whispering prayers. For many Chileans, it was the first time in 15 years they felt their voices could matter. The atmosphere mixed fear with determination. Inside voting booths, hands trembled as ballots were marked with yes or no. Each slip of paper symbolized more than preference. It represented years of silence, loss, and longing. By evening, the tension was unbearable. Families gathered around radios and televisions, waiting for news. Rumours spread quickly. The no vote was ahead. The regime delayed announcements, and at one point officials considered discarding results. But pressure from observers, the presence of international attention, and divisions even within the armed forces made fraud too risky. Finally, the outcome was confirmed. 55% had voted no. Pinochet's rule was not immediately over, but his path to indefinite power was broken. Jubilation erupted across Chile. People poured into the streets, waving flags, singing and embracing strangers. For the first time in years, joy replaced fear. The sound of pots and pans, once a symbol of protest, now rang as celebration. Yet the victory was tempered with caution. Pinochet remained head of the army, and the transition would be gradual. The new constitution still gave him influence, and the dangers of backlash were real. But for Chileans who had endured 15 years of dictatorship, the vote was proof that change was possible. Internationally, the result was hailed as a triumph of democracy over fear. Exiles celebrated abroad, while human rights groups praised the courage of Chile's people. The plebiscite did not erase the years of repression, nor did it bring immediate justice for the disappeared, but it marked the turning point. Chile had chosen a different path, and the echo of that decision carried far beyond its borders. The years following the 1988 plebiscite marked the long and careful path back to democracy. Though the No campaign had triumphed, Pinochet did not immediately step aside. Instead, a transition process was negotiated, shaped by the very constitution his regime had created. Elections were scheduled for 1989, and political parties once silenced began to re-emerge openly. Campaign rallies filled streets once patrolled by tanks, and Chileans, after years of whispers, spoke freely again. In December 1989, Patricio Aylwin, a Christian Democrat and candidate of the opposition coalition, was elected president. His victory symbolized the return of civilian rule. Yet even as Chile celebrated, the shadow of dictatorship lingered. Pinochet retained his position as commander-in-chief of the army, ensuring the military's influence remained. The new democracy was fragile, balanced carefully between progress and the threat of regression. For families of the disappeared, the transition brought both relief and sorrow. Freedom returned, but loved ones did not. The vicariate of solidarity handed over its files, and human rights commissions began to investigate. Testimonies were gathered, lists compiled, and graves uncovered. The truth emerged slowly, each revelation painful, yet necessary. Chile confronted not only the loss of democracy, but also the deep wounds left by repression. Economically, the country continued reforms, balancing growth with attempts to reduce inequality. For many, the 1990s brought new opportunities, but memories of hardship remained close. The divide between the prosperous and the poor did not vanish with democracy. Still, the atmosphere was transformed. Censorship lifted, music and art flourished, and public debate returned. Streets once silenced by fear now echoed with voices, chants, and laughter. Internationally, Chile became a symbol of peaceful transition, studied by scholars and celebrated by Democrats worldwide. Yet justice was incomplete. Pinochet lived for years with immunity, his presence a constant reminder of unresolved history. Only in later decades did legal challenges truly confront him, though many victims never saw full accountability. For Chileans, the memory of September 11th, 1973, and the long years of dictatorship became part of national identity, an unhealed scar, but also a lesson. Today, the story of that period is told not only in books and classrooms, but in songs, murals, and family gatherings. It is remembered as the day democracy died, and the long struggle that eventually brought it back. Chile's journey through darkness, repression, and resistance showed the world that even under the heaviest silence, the human spirit can endure, and that one day hope can rise again.